I can stay in academic medicine and no one's ever going to have to bother me about doing research.
Welcome back to PedsCrit. I'm Zach Hodges.
And I'm Al Shanklin.
Today we have Dr. Sapna Kudchadkar. She is the Anesthesiologist-in-Chief of the Johns Hopkins Children's Center and Vice Chair for Pediatric Anesthesiology and Critical Care Medicine at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. She completed her training in pediatrics, pediatric intensive care, anesthesiology, and pediatric anesthesiology at Johns Hopkins, during which she also received her PhD in clinical investigation at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Sapna Kudchadkar is now the lead PI for a 10-site randomized controlled trial of a multifaceted early mobility program for critically ill children, better known as PICU Up.
Yes. We were so excited to talk about how exactly she went from choosing to be dual trained as a strong clinical niche that wouldn't require research to leading a funded R01, a large multi-center trial. I was fascinated to ask these questions and so grateful that she was willing to talk with us.
Yes, virtual mentorship, as we've said so many times in the past. We're so excited to share her story with you.
Dr. Kuchadkar, thank you so much for sharing your clinical approach with us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
As an early career intensivist, looking at the scope of your career, I'm so curious. You've done anesthesia training, you've done PICU training, you have a PhD. You started this locally at Hopkins with a QI project, and you've scaled it to a funded R01 in a multi-center trial. Can you talk to us about when you sort of accomplished the core pieces of your academic journey, how you got funding, how you ended up where you are?
Sure, I'd love to. So I'm going to take it a couple steps back even further, because I think for anyone who's considering a career in academic medicine, and especially if pediatric critical care is in your future or you're currently in the training process, you just have to keep your mind open to all possibilities and opportunities. I think that's my first kind of big picture message. And the reason I say that is because if you asked Sapna circa 2003, starting pediatric residency at Johns Hopkins, whether she was going to be a clinician scientist in 2024, I would have been like, heck no, absolutely not.
Yes.
When I started as a pediatric intern here, I was just thrilled that I matched at the same city that my husband was doing law school in. And it's like, I'm going to be an amazing general pediatrician. That's my goal. And I'm going to finish these 3 years, go out and start making a little cash at least, and move on. And so peds residency happened. And then I was like, man, I love this acute care stuff. I thought I was going to be a neonatologist. And then I did PICU. And as we all know, we fell in love with the heterogeneity, the never knowing what's going to come through the doors, and, all of the things that draw us to acute care and ICU. So then I also was like, oh my gosh, I love how my anesthesia colleagues think about this stuff. I love being able to handle airways and kind of deal with sedation and analgesia and all these things. And so I decided to do anesthesia residency because, again, I had role models around who had done the combined training here, and it just made sense. Extending obviously time and energy, but totally a worthwhile decision. So then my thought process then was, oh man, I can stay in academic medicine and no one's ever going to have to bother me about doing research, because I am invaluable as a clinician. If they don't need me in the PICU, right, I can go work in the OR. And let's say the PICU's full with staff, I can just go straight to the OR. I will always be valuable to an academic institution. I know this all sounds very egotistical, but at the time I was like, no one will tell me to do research because I hate research. And the reason that I hated research is because my only experience had been as a work study program in undergrad, like many other people, where I worked in a reproductive endocrinology lab and did pap smears on mice at 2 a.m. That was my thing. And so I was a second author on a paper, and it was enough to get me into residency, but I was happy with that because I was like, man, research isn't my thing. And it wasn't my thing because I didn't have the context. I didn't have the clinical acumen at the time to really understand the importance of what I was doing. So then fellowship ensues. And I think I was under an operating room table emptying a Foley bag when one of my attendings walked into the room and said, hey, Sapna, you're a PICU person too. What do you think about sleep in the intensive care unit? And I was like, I don't really care right now. I'm emptying urine into a container. Let's move on. But then he said it. And the next week I was in the PICU rounding, and this kid had their eyes closed and they were just laying there. And we kept using the term sleep to talk about the child and their sedation. And I just couldn't get that question out of my head. So I will be fully honest that any of the research things that I've done in my career actually were other people's ideas that I
Mhm.
just took to fruition and built upon and grew. So his question really started to bother me. And then I said, well, has anyone studied sleep in the PICU? And the answer was, four people had, and they had
Mhm.
published their random small studies. So I did a systematic review on the topic, which is, for the listeners, always a systematic scoping. There's multiple types of reviews, but it's always a good way to learn the literature and figure out if something's worth pursuing. And then I was like, man, no one's studying this. And this is like, with my anesthesia hat and my PICU hat, this is something that I could really try. It was hard work. I had to identify mentors who were willing to take me on to study this really new field, right? Because anytime you're thinking about a research question, is it relevant? Does someone care? Or should we care? And is it feasible? And I wasn't sure about either of those things at the time. So it was a bit of a gamble. But luckily, I had mentors who really invested in me, took me on, and I applied for my first grant. And I never thought I would do that, right? Then the kind of got bit by the bug, and I started researching sleep in the ICU. I started doing actigraphy and EEG on these patients. At the time, if you asked me, I was going to be studying delirium or mobility, I would have said, what are those? What are
Mhm.
those things,
Mhm.
right? And then slowly but surely, that entire research question progressed into where we are today. So I will say that many of our failures turn into major opportunities. So one thing I'm very freely discuss with everyone is the fact that I applied for 4 K-23s in the course of my early stage career, and each of those got rejected by the NIH. The NIH was just
Wow.
not ready to fund a study focused on sleep in critically ill children. There just wasn't enough kind of proof of concept. It was not an ideal early career grant in their opinion, and it was demoralizing. I had luckily gotten a K-12 award for the sleep work here at Hopkins, an institutional KL2. Then I decided to get my PhD because I discovered that if I wanted to do some of this work independently one day, that it would really help to have that kind of foundational didactic rigorous training under my belt. And if you have a public health school like Bloomberg across the street, like, why not take advantage of that
Oh yeah.
opportunity? So I've kind of gone full circle. My dad was like, wait, what? You went from, doing general pediatrics to doing 2 residencies, 2 fellowships, and now a PhD. But for me, it made sense because of what my overall passions and interests were. And so I tried for the K-23s 4 times, rejected each time. And then I was at a crossroads, honestly. I was like, what's the point? I thought I was going to be like this classic NIH funded clinician scientist pathway, but clearly that's not in the cards. So maybe I should just stop. Maybe I just go back to my original plan, which is to be invaluable to the institution and work in the OR and the ICU. But then again, remember, the best ideas often don't come from your own brain. They come from someone else's. One of our nurse practitioners at Kennedy Krieger Institute across the street, our Neurodevelopmental Rehab Institute, said, Sapna, I spend half my time working at Kennedy, half my time in the PICU. I don't understand why all our kids are just laying around and not moving. We talk about getting rehab consults on kids and sending them to KKI after, but why aren't we doing any of that stuff beforehand? And our adult colleagues are doing it. And again, another question that she didn't have the time or the resources to answer that question in a rigorous way, but I could, and I could bring her onto the team and we could develop a team to start to explore that. And that's how PICU Up was born. So basically, Beth Wazorek, and I got in a room with a bunch of other multi-professional folks from our unit and said, no one else is looking at this in kids. Let's learn from our adult colleagues and let's see if we can adapt what they're doing to impact children. And that led to a single center quality improvement project at Johns Hopkins, looking at 100 kids pre and 100 kids post the PICU Up intervention. It took us a year to design it and implement it. And it's not a large enough study to show outcome differences, but it showed it was safe and it was feasible and that you could move kids more if you implement a program like that. So it could have been case closed because it was a single center QI study that got published in the online version of PCCM, didn't even make the print version. And so, we could have moved on. But as you know, as that resident knows who follows people on X, social media is something I'm incredibly passionate about. And dissemination is really important. A lot of people think that when you promote your own work, it's like bragging about your stuff. But I
Mhm.
feel strongly, like Alice and Zach, if you publish research, who better to talk about it than you? Why wouldn't you go out and disseminate that work, right? So then I started talking about PICU Up and I posted it on social media and started thinking about it more, about whether I could disseminate this more broadly. And you can imagine the attention was wide and vast. And people were like, wait, what? We want to try this. Well, this
Yeah.
kind of makes sense. The way it ended up as a multi-center trial was, again, proof of concept showing it could be done in a group of 6 studies as part of a foundation grant. Again, NIH wasn't ready to fund this yet either. So I had to prove through this foundation grant that I had pilot data that made it feasible and pragmatic. And then we applied for the R01. And unlike my 4K23s that failed, I was funded on the first submission because the story made sense. And it's all about story and evidence. And those two things came together. So that's the long explanation for how we got here. And, it's been the most incredible thing that I could have ever imagined in terms of the people I get to interact with. It's the most multi-professional initiative possible. And you can do it in a low resource setting or a high resource setting. Just adapt it to your own needs.
Oh, that's amazing. And the ultimate success story in our minds. Is it fair to say that you sort of, in training, were able to get the institutional K, establish mentorship, end up as early faculty, and then it was, okay,
Absolutely.
NIH is presumably not interested in sleep at this time. How are we moving this forward? And you discovered something amazing.
Yeah, that's perfectly summarized. I think there are a couple very lucky things that happened for me that may not be as natural for others, in their current scenarios, which were A, I was training at the institution that I wanted to stay at, and B, it's an institution that is well resourced with regards to infrastructure for research and people. Amazing people. And our children's center is not freestanding. It's attached to the adult hospital. So that brought huge advantages for me because I could pull from adult medicine and ICU mentors across the hospital system. And then I had Mela Bembeya, who many of you may know. She's internationally known in the ECMO biomarker space in the PICU. She was 1 year above me in fellowship. And the only reason I applied for a KL2 was because I saw Mela in the fellow's office a year before, beaming with pride. And she's not a shout from the rooftops kind of gal. And I was like, Mela, why are you so happy? And she's like, I just found out I got this grant that's going to protect me for 80% of my time for 2 years while I get my PhD at Bloomberg. And if I had not run into Mela that day and heard about that, I wouldn't have learned from her and decided I wanted to follow in her footsteps. So lots of lucky things. But I think for all of you listening, you all have lucky things. You just may or may not know when to take grasp of them and go with it. Listen to people who have cool ideas. Obviously, don't steal ideas, but these ideas all came to me from people who were only asking because they wanted me to take their idea and run with it. So listen for new and cool ideas and take opportunities that you may or may not have initially considered.
Oh, that's beautiful. And follow your successful friends. Reminds me of my co-fellows.
Yes, follow. Absolutely. There's nothing wrong with being a copycat in that regard. Like I tell Mela all the time, she's still one of my closest friends and colleagues. And I'm like, Mela, you realize the only reason any of this has happened is because I ran into you in that fellow's office that day, right? Or I tell Myron Yaster, the only reason any of this happened is because you came and accosted me while I was emptying a Foley bag. Like, all of it was meant to be.
That is awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. We are so appreciative.
My gosh, it was my pleasure. You guys are awesome. Thank you for having me.
And thank you for listening to this episode of PedsCrit. Please remember that all content during this episode is intended for informational and educational purposes only. It should not be used as a replacement for medical advice. It's also worth noting that the views expressed during this episode by me, Zach, and our guests are our own and do not reflect the official position of our institutions. If you have any comments, suggestions, or feedback, you can email us at pedscritpodcast@gmail.com. If you want to help support the production of PedsCrit, you can find us on Venmo and Patreon. We've also had some light merch made in the form of PedsCrit laptop stickers, and if you include a mailing address with any contribution, we would be so excited to send you one. Thank you again for listening.